Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're at the bottom of page 1341. Aleph Shin Mem Aleph. So though we began by saying that there are two causes for rachamim, and they are the difference between a rachamim of, let's call it among peers, where there's something in common, you feel the need, the pain, which evokes empathy to the person. The second is mitzad reimamus, not because there's something in common, but because somebody who's just exalted like a king, and everybody is equal to him, but he shows compassion, because that's what the nature of a merumam, of someone who's exalted, someone who's on a higher level, has that compassion. But those are both causes and are reasons for rachamim. Then there's the third level that we learned, even though he doesn't call it a third level. I called it that. I just want to be accurate that it's not an Eifon Gimel. He doesn't say an Eifon Gimel. He just says that there's another level that has nothing in common at all. Because even level 2, though it's a reimamus, and it's not because it's a peer and something that's on the same level, but still it's the king of this nation. Lamaila is the levels before the tzimtzum that in some ways envisioning existence, or even higher than that, gili la'atzmei, a gili, but it's still something has manifest, and therefore that manifestation has some, even if it's distant, but some relationship, like he said, like Seviv Kalam. It's transcendence beyond, but it still has some hergish, tzas hergish, he called it. And Malchus, he called it aleis harotzen, or even higher than that, it's still a gili oyer ba'atzmusei. So there's something there, like let's say we talked about envisioning a home. So that's already relating to the home. But then there is within the person, he's not yet even envisioning it, he just has a gili la'atzmei that is not yet expressing to another, or even thinking about another, but to himself, he's already thinking about it. That's just an example. So some gili la'atzmusei. Then there's a level, just to use the language exactly, atzmusei sof shemerum moved the legamri, what he called hamelech hakodesh, hamelech melech yochid, bilode ein elikim, ein eid movade. All these are terms that express, that define a level that's completely nothing else but him. Is godliness in its purest form. So it's not godliness that relates to existence, not even godliness that's relating to himself, which will ultimately lead to the creation of existence, but rather completely within himself. And there we request on a mavakshim, he said the expression is alikei elam, but we say, b'rachamecha rabim rachem aleinu. And we're still requesting that the rachamim should come from that level. Meaning there's no reason for it, because there's no connection. It's not like beseeching a king to have compassion on his people. There's some connection. Here, there's no connection initially. Talk about connections. Is our connection good here? I just got some message. I just want to make sure you hear me well and see me. All good?
We hear
perfect.
You. Perfect.
Okay.
Seems fine to me.
Okay. So we are connected. Good. Yeah. So this is referring what he calls etzem ha'or shelamay legam b'chinas gilui la'atzmei. And I explained that etzem ha'or in the world of gilui, it's the highest possible level as it's encompassed in its source. The etzem ha'or. So there's no gilui, even gilui la'atzmei. But it is ultimately God's power, if you wish, to express himself. But he hasn't expressed yet anything. And then he says, and that's all the makivim come from there, and that he calls the Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim. So clearly he's using Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim on different levels, as I mentioned yesterday. But we'll see, once we finish the subject, I'll try to organize exactly. So clearly there are different levels of Rachamim here, that's for sure. Okay. I said, so this he identifies with these words. Bechinas harachmim shemebchinas reimamus ha'atzmis shemerumim be'etzem. So this is Reimus Atzmis, not even the Reimus of level 2 that he talked about before. Reimus Atzmis, Smurumam Be'etzem, fundamentally a different level altogether. And he calls this Bechinas Etzmeir, Ulemaylam Bezechinas Helama Atzmi. As I've already explained, he's been using those two terms a few times in this fashion, because clearly he wants to talk about, the Rebbe Rashab wants to talk about a level that is Etzem Ohr. In the world of Ohr is the Etzem, and even higher, Helama Atzmi, which is even higher than Ohr altogether. Complete Helama Atzmi, fundamental concealment. As I mentioned, just to give you one place where he says it explicitly, just to show for comparative purposes, when he spoke about the Rishimu, so he said like this. I'm going back a while now. Let's just find it all the way back to the Rishimu. I think that was the first time, if I recall, the first time where he mentions it right here. Just want to see it myself as well. I think it's in the Reish Samachs, right? Yeah. I'm looking right now at page 1270. On top of the page. Actually, I'll start from 1269 at the bottom. So he says there, when he talks about the difference between the Shimu and the Kav, the root of the containers and the root of the Ohr. And he says there that the Neshima has two things in it, the Etzem Nekudus Shimu, and the Ohr Ein Sof, which is within it, concealed within it. What we learned later as well, he referred to it. So if you look close to the bottom of the page, he says these words. So the Koich HaGvul is the Etzem Nekudus Shimu. He says like this. Omnam etzem nekudus arashimi yesh leimer shum b'chinas etzem ha'or mamish hainu b'chinas helam ha'or shelo ma'ale gam b'chinas or pnimius ha'or. So he calls it etzem ha'or. Hu b'chinas hu shelamayla b'chinas shmoi. So the hu b'shmoi b'lvad. So shmoi is already a level of gilui, even if it's a gilui pnimius ha'gilui, like he says at the top of the page. So now we're talking about that it's Etzem Ohr. Then on the top of page 1270, he continues and says, I'm just going to skip a few lines. Yeah, so 4 lines from the end of the paragraph, on the top of page 1270, he says, okay, Helama Ohr, he calls it, higher than Gili altogether. The Gam Yeshlema, the Shorsho, B'chinas Helama Atzmi, the Ein Sof, the Hayin B'chinas Shmoya Kol Batz Musay. So you see here, that he talks about Helama Ohr or Etzem Ohr, and then he goes even higher and says that Helama Atzmi, which is the Shmoy encompassed in Atzmusay, She'ein b'chinas Ohr klal, not even Etzem Ohr, ki'im b'chinas yechelis. So this is the first time where he mentions these two, and in the same sentence, he talks about first one level, and then he goes a level above it. And a few other times he said this. I'm not going to go through all of them now, I have to find them, but that was, I believe, the first time that he mentioned it. So going back now to where we are, that's what he's defining, that bottom of 1341. That's what he defines as being rachmim of remus ha'atzmis. Etzem Ohr elamayl mezeh helam ha'atzmi. Okay. And I explained several times and this is my own explanation, he doesn't say it explicitly, that the reason he brings these two, because ultimately these are the place, this is the juncture where Ohr meets Helam, basically. The Helam Ha'atzmi meets Etzem Ohr, because both are coming from the Etzem. One is going to ultimately evolve into Giluim, even though it's not Gilu yet, and the other is going to evolve into Helamis, into Gvuras, and Tzimtzumim. So one is like the Kav of Chesed, and one is the Kav of Gvura. But in their root, when you go to the top, so to speak, they're both a level that's completely removed from existence. One is Etzem Ohr, the world of Gili, removed from existence, and one is Helam Ha'atzmi, completely removed from any Gili altogether. And that's going to later, and not later, even earlier, explain that ultimately the third sweetening of the Gvuris is coming from within Cheshach, from the Helam Ha'atzmi, that is embedded, the root, embedded in all the concealments. But remember, at the end of the day, we do want to have Etzem Begili. So you really want both. And that's why it's important that they both are connected with each other ultimately. That's the way I would explain why he's saying it together. And it's not, why would you bring together Ohr and Helam? For this reason that I just described, and as I explained several times. And the final thing to review here before we continue, he connected it to Rosh Hashanah. So the first parentheses, he says, this is Atzmus Ein Sof. When we are invoking this Rachamim, what we're doing is Atzmus Ein Sof, Kav Yochel, so to speak, is Mashpil. He goes down a level, because as we just said, he's complete Ein Eid Mavadeh, nothing but God. There's nothing else. So we on Rosh Hashanah, we say, Zikaron L'Yem Rishon, we're asking God to remember Yem Rishon, the Reishis HaGili, of when you began the Gili, when you first created the world, you went down a level from your own inner essence. You began to relate to another, which ultimately leads to creation. That relationship consists of two levels, Gili La'atzmei and Gili Le'tzerech Ha'elamis, a revelation, first revelation within yourself, that you are so-called in a state of expression, a state of revelation, and then a lower level that you begin to envision and relate to existence. So that's, as you did it in the beginning, Yom Rishon. So currently, Yom Rishon, we're asking you to do this again every Rosh Hashanah, that Atzmus Ein Sof, Mashpil Atzmei, Lizker B'chinas Reishis HaGili, that he should remember that Gilui, the two levels of Giluyim. So we're going up to the third level, to the higher level, that's Atzmius, the core level, to draw down from there. That's the Zechrenis. Okay. That's the Zechrenis that we say, Zechrenis Roshon Shel Achar Malchus. Malchus Zechrenis Shefris. Right. So we say Malchus to say we're asking God to be king. And how do we do that? By saying remember, or draw that, remember, in other words, manifest in some form of consciousness, of memory, which is drawing down from the Etzem into Gilui La'atzmei and Gilui L'tzerech Ha'elamis. Okay, Reishis HaGilui. And how does this achieved? How can we have the power? Why would God listen to us, so to speak? He's completely removed. It's because of the Bittul Hayesh that we show. When we go out of our comfort zone and we suspend our own egos and sense of self, that Bittul Hayesh touches that Etzem. As we'll soon explain, that's ultimately going to be the third level of Teshuva that reaches in the Helam Ha'atzmi, or Etzem Ohr and the Helam Ha'atzmi. And that's the Bittul Hayesh. We're going to learn this in a moment, but that's what he says, Bittul Hayesh. And what is that in Rosh Hashanah terms? That's Shefer. So you have Malchus, we ask God to be king. Zechrenis, drawing down from the Etzem into Gilui, Zikaron L'Yem Rishon. And Bameh, by Shefer. And how? Through Shefer. Shefer is from an ayil, from a ram. A ram symbolizes the Nefesh Habamis, the Yesh of the animal soul. So that's the Bittul Hayesh, the Hema. That gives the power to invoke God's so-called re-entry into what we would call, we say, remember us, or we say, remember. Obviously, God didn't forget, but it meant that we're asking him to come into a state where you are relating to us. So you say to someone who loves you, and you love them, and you say, please remember me. It's not because they don't know who you are. It's you're trying to bring it into a conscious Gilui. That's the whole point. And that's what Rosh Hashanah is. So we're going to continue now from line 3 from the bottom on page 1341. And I think all this will become clear as he ties it all together now in the next few, the next part of the paragraph till the end of the paragraph on the next page. So I reserve any questions till we go through it because he's going to explain this now more, a little more in depth. Okay. So the pages that can be found if you want to follow the text at ayinbeis.com, 3 lines from the bottom of page 1341. V'zeu shomer Razal, and this is what the sages say, G'deilim ma'aseh tzaddikim and ma'aseh shemayim va'aretz. So here's the expression, that the actions, that the work of tzaddikim, of the righteous, is greater than the creation of heaven and earth. Which is a very powerful statement. How could you say such a thing? God created Yesh Ma'ayin. A God that's completely removed from existence, created something that has an independent entity with that leap from Ayin to Yesh. So how do you say that the Ma'aseh Tzaddikim is greater than that? So he explains, the Ma'aseh Shemayim V'Aretz Huma Ayin L'Yesh. Because Ma'aseh Shemayim V'Aretz is taking something from an ayin. Ayin here means not nothingness, but ayin means a state that's completely non-existent. From our perspective, an ayin is a non-existent state, meaning it's a different reality. And God has the power to create from one reality instead of just an extension. Like if it would be yesh mi yesh or ayin ma ayin, it would be like Ohr creating more Ohr. But that's not the chiddush here. Here we have Ohr creating Yesh. We're having something that's creating a completely different identity that's not in any way an extension of a previous identity. That's Yesh Ma'ayin. And Ma'aseh Tzaddikim is greater than that because Ma'aseh Tzaddikim does the opposite. It makes from Yesh to Ayin. It takes the Yesh of this world, an independent consciousness that has its own ego and its own sense of self. And the tzaddikim, through their avodah, what do? They reverse the process. They turn a yesh into an ayin, into bittul to alakus. So that is greater. Why? Because God creates from ayin to yesh. That's a big thing. But to take the yesh that God created and turn it back to ayin, that's even greater. He's going to explain why. So he says like this.
These are 2 different ayins that mean different, though.
Why are they different?
One is the ayin, one is the ayin of non-existence, and one of the ayin of something that exists, but it has a very low. It's completely bittul.
Taking the existence, the one is the ayin of non-existence of a yesh, but it's the non-existence of godliness. Godliness is not a state of existence in our perception; it's completely different reality. So basically, it's saying God took godliness, and from that created a yesh that has its own independent ego. Tzaddikim take independent ego and turn it into godliness, into ayin. That's the shot. So he says the eina kavona, the intention in this when we say that tzaddikim turn the yesh la'ayin, the kavona is not only shemagia rakba. It's not that shemagia that reaches only ba'ayin shel yesh. Because then it would be, okay, there's the etzem, the core source. The core source has a state of revelation. We called it earlier the ayin of the yesh amiti. However you define it, but it's not the yesh amiti. It's an ayin. It's a state of bittul, oir, ruchnius, spirituality, godliness. When they would return the ayin, the yesh to an ayin, so it's not like the ayin shala yesh. Then why do you call it greater then? If you say it's greater, it means that they're reaching even a higher level than the original ayin. The sublimation of the yesh of existence to ayin, next page, So I don't know if that's what you were referring to when you asked your question, but here he's saying that
it wasn't. I let me tell you, this is a big thing to me. What we just read. very big. It's like we're learning almost the purpose of creation, right? It's unbelievably beautiful.
Yeah. Okay, so Maisa said Yesh la'ayin. I'll explain that in a moment. Because then why is it greater? You're just returning it, even though, frankly, you could say it's greater because you took something that God created a yesh and you turned it to an ayin. That's greater than God creating from an ayin to yesh. However, he's not sufficing with that. To say g'deilim, you have to say it reaches a higher level. It's not just that you took something that God created and you turned it back to what it was originally, but you reach even higher, like he says, abitla yesh la'ayin. He reads the atzmis that's higher than ayin, also in the original root and source. So let me explain this before we read on, because this is now going to be very, very dense and brief. But if you recall what we've learned the last 20 pages, you'll see the Rebbe Rashab is going to tie it all together, and he's going to refer to expressions that we've learned already. I'll explain each piece, but remember that this all is going to use language from earlier on. So the more you remember what we learned earlier, the better, the easier it's going to be to understand the next few lines. But before we continue, let me just explain it in simple terms. At the end of volume 2, you may recall we learned about yesh, that in the Seder Shtalshlos, everything is yesh, ayin, yesh. Yesh means the source, an entity that exists. Then the last yesh is the creation. So you have the producer and you have the product, the two states of yesh. In between, there's an ayin. Now that's necessary whenever you create something really of substance, of something significant. It requires these 3 steps. If you take, for example, a teacher and a student, you don't need necessarily the 3 steps in usual communication, because he takes the idea. Yes, he does create a certain type of tzimtzum, so there is some ayin, and then, but the idea still in the student is somewhat relates to the teacher. So there's also yesh, ayin, yesh. The teacher's mind, the student's mind, and the ayin is the channel that connects them, which can be tzimtzum, concealment, examples. But this is much more pronounced when you're talking about creating something. When, for example, you want to create something new, like a child being born is a new creation, or the creation of existence itself. So there it's much more pronounced, the yesh, ayin, yesh, because you want to really you want to create a new paradigm. Whenever there's a new paradigm, you need to have a void or a vacuum in between. And that's what we call ayin. But then he went further and said that ayin breaks into 2. There's the ayin of the yesh amiti. That is the way the divine source manifests in Ohr, or the different levels he explained. It's manifesting. So in other words, it's stepping down a step. And then there's the ayin of the yesh hanivra, is how that step, the ayin of the yesh amiti, goes through the different stages of evolution and concealments to become an ayin that now can be called the source for the yesh hanivra. So really what you have is 2 ends of the spectrum, yesh and yesh. And in between is like a channel that's the ayin of the yesh amiti and the ayin of the yesh hanivra. And he gave many examples of what that represents. Like, for example, one example would be that the gili la'atzmai is the ayin of the yesh amiti. The gili lezulas, the revelation to the other, is the ayin of the yesh hanivra, because it's already relating. It's still an ayin, because it's still within the core of the creator, but it's as he's relating. Like, or the difference between Yud K and Vav K, or the difference between the Ohr before the Tzimtzum and the Ohr after the Tzimtzum. All these were different examples that he gave, different levels of explaining the 2 levels of ayin. Sevav Kalaman, Mamala Kalaman, like we learned here. Mamala Kalaman is the divine energy that creates and sustains existence and relates to existence, like Yehi Ohr, Yehi Rakia. And then there's the level of, that's the Kav, the Mamala Kalaman. Sevav Kalaman would be the Ratzon Hashem, God's will to create. Let's say Breishis Barakim, the general will to create existence. So it's already a level of not the yesh amiti, it's ayin, but it's a general ayin. Then there's the ayin as it is tailored to and manifests specifically in each part of creation. So essentially, it's like a way of seeing the map. If you talk about the nefesh or adam, the person has a soul, and then we have our faculty. I'm using my faculty now, let's say my hand, to write something. So how does it move from the soul energy into my handwriting? So there's the soul is the source. It then manifests in the ayin in some form of gili of the nefesh, which ultimately will break down into the specific koiches hanefesh, faculties. That's the ayin of the yesh hanivra. And then when it actually is actualized, when I'm using that faculty, that ayin of the yesh hanivra is energizing my hand, aligned with the ayin of the yesh hamiti of the nefesh itself. Well, yesh hamiti refers usually to the Eibush, to God, but the idea is that we have here these four stages. Here he's not interested in going into it's not relevant to go into the details of the levels of ayin, but basically saying like this, that God took an ayin eliki, a divine state that is what we would call something that's non-existential, beyond our definition of yesh. So it's not like like ilav olol, for example, cause and effect, where I take a flame and I light another flame from it. That's two entities that are in the same realm, same domain. Yesh and ayin are two different domains. So God created from ayin to yesh. The tzaddikim, which really refers to everyone who does serving God, takes the yesh, and instead of indulging in our own self-interest, we realign the yesh toward the ayin. So we turn yesh to ayin, but he's saying here, not just that you're reverting it back to the godliness that created it, meaning the levels of godliness that relate to it, but you're going all the way to the creation, to the, like he says, the words are, meaning all the way up before the tzimtzum, that level that we talked about, that's higher than Gilui La'atzme even, and higher than Gilui L'Tzerech HaElemis, something in the etzem itself. So that's what makes a G'dei L'Maaseh Tzaddikim, because Tzaddikim, through their avodah, they transform the yesh and they bring it all the way back to the source. The question is, why is that greater? Because they do something that is even greater than creation itself. And that's going to be what we're going to learn now, the Maila of Ohr Chozer. Remember the avodah of El Mata L'Maila. When we do something from the bottom up, it has something, a power that is more powerful than when it comes from the top down, no matter how high God reveals and ultimately expresses himself and creates existence. The avodah that comes from the bottom up, from the yesh being transformed, reaches a deeper place in the etzem ha'or and even higher in the helam ha'atzmi. That's now what we're going to learn inside. So that's what the G'dei L'Maaseh Tzaddikim is. So now he's bringing back everything we've learned. So the rachamim that we're invoking, especially on Rosh Hashanah, like he said, where we're drawing down from the etzem, from a place that is completely beyond existence, is possible only through our avodah, because God said, your avodah reaches that place within me that's deeper than even my revelation to create. So in other words, to use the example I've been giving about the artist, or let's use the example of the arc of building a home. So you want to build a home. We said that's part of the etzem of the person wants a home. The person is not complete without a home. But that can remain dormant and completely concealed within your etzem. There comes a point where you begin thinking about it and you're conscious of it to yourself. There then comes a point where you're conscious and you relate and envision what that existence will be, and you begin to think about the other, the creation of that house. You communicate, and then you ultimately build it. But there's one thing missing here. What happens once the house is built? Who's living in it? And why are you building a house? So now come the tzaddikim. The purpose of existence is that you built a house for the people in this world, for the neshamas to come into a physical world, take the house, which is the creation, and turn it into a dira b'tachtenim, a home for God. That reaches deeper than God's will, desire to have a home, because now it's fulfilling the inner purpose of the etzem itself that goes even higher than the gilui. The gilui was necessary to create existence, but to fulfill the purpose of existence requires going into this dark world, into this home, into the structure that God created, and turning the yesh into an ayin. That reaches all the way to the core of what the real purpose was in the first place. Because why did God want a house in the first place? He wanted a dira b'tachtenim. So the same thing with a human being. The fact that we want a home, the ultimate purpose, not just because we want a home, we want to have a place where we are comfortable, that we can call our own. A place that you're not living in the street, you're not homeless, you're not anywhere, you have a place of your own, a place with your family, with your children, a place that you can do what you have to fulfill in this world. You have a home base, so to speak. So that reaches deeper all the way because it's coming now from the bottom up. And that's the avoid of a person. That's only an avoid of the person can do that. Kavyochel, God himself, cannot do the avodah for us because that would defeat the whole purpose. If God does it himself, then it's not a dira b'tachtenim. It's he built a world and he reveals himself in his own world. That's not the kavanah. So the kavanah is there should be dafka helam. Tachtenim, as the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, is the lowest world in the concealment, in the revelation. That it's the lowest, the deepest form of concealment. Tachten shein tachta lamata mimenu. Why? Because we don't feel godliness in this world, and it's there where God wants his home, in this dark world. So it's the Aveda that we do here that reaches this highest, deepest level, all the way to the Helam Ha'atzmi. And that's why the Bitla Yesh of the Shefer and Rosh Hashanah, or the Bitla Yesh in general of our Aveda, reaches this level of the G'dei Ma'aseh Tzaddikim, higher than the creation itself, which also comes from high levels, however, not from the deepest levels of Helam Ha'atzmi. So we're going to learn this now inside.
That's shifting the whole symptom up. This is another way of saying it. Wow.
Yeah, well, it's shifting and saying that the purpose of the tzimtzum is in order to bring gilui. Exactly. The purpose of there's the gilui that is followed by the tzimtzum to create, and then there's when we transform the tzimtzum, that which is the whole theme of Ayin Beis, especially the second half that we've been learning since the middle of volume 2. When we transform the tzimtzum, we are reversing the process, and we're transforming and bringing it back all the way to the Helam Ha'atzmi, which is the root of the containers, the Rishimu, the Butzina, the Kardanissa, the Gvuras, the Tagberis Achayis, everything we've been learning about. The third level of the sweetening of the Gvuras, which is the highest level, of course, of transformation. But remember, we still have to go through the lower levels because you first also need that the Keli should be a Keli to the Ohr before the Keli reveals the source of the Keli, which is higher than the Ohr. So the Guf, the body, has to first align itself to the soul, and then ultimately we reach a place where the body is even higher than the root of the body is higher than the root of the soul, and it feeds and nourishes the soul, the Neshama Nuzunis Min HaGuf, as it will be in the future when Mashiach comes. That's what he's now going to tie it all together now. That's why it's so important to know what he said earlier, and I'm just bringing it together and explaining it. Okay, so let's read inside, and you'll see he's going to bring everything we learned the last, literally, I would say, 20 pages at least. I would say even more, maybe 30, 40, maybe even 30 pages. He's now going to tie it all together, because you'll see the next paragraph, he goes back to Tzaddikim and Balei Teshuva, the themes that went back all the way back to page 1306. We're now 1342. So this is a good 40 pages that he's now going to sum up, actually. But more than sum up, he's going to tie together all the pieces. And let's see here, all the pieces, Rachamim, the Tzur. Yeah, so the next few lines is going to be very brief, but every line is packed with a condensed summary of everything we've learned till now. So let's trudge through this, okay? So now he says, line 2, I'm on top of 1342. V'zehu mailas Ohr Chozer al Ohr Yashar. Now you may remember that expression, Ohr Chozer al Ohr Yashar. Ohr Chozer is the returning light, literally, which means the retractive light, like moon, as opposed to the sun. Ohr Yashar is a direct light. So when I'm shining a light to you, that's Ohr Yashar. When you shine back to me, like Talmidim, the students shine back to the teacher, that's Ohr Chozer. So Ohr Yashar refers to Mamayla Lamata. Ohr Chozer is always Mamatlamis. Sometimes another way of putting it is Asrusa de La'ela, the awakening from above, or Hamshachas Mad, Mayin Tchurin, the male, the Zohar, the masculine Hashpa, and Mayin Nukfin, Asrusa de Latata, the awakening from below. Mayin Nukfin is the waters of the Nekeva, of the feminine waters that rise from the bottom up. Or the sun and the moon is the classic example. Talmud Yerushalmi, Talmud Bavli. Yerushalmi is far more direct, getting the message, Bavli goes through questions and arguments and counter arguments till you get that clarity. So it's two approaches. The Ohr Yosher is always a more powerful light, but the Ohr Chozer is a more qualitative light. It could be a weaker light, but it's coming from within. It's coming from the bottom up. And that is always more pneumistic. And ultimately, the more the kavanah. So Ohr Chozer, Ohr Yosher, if you want me to find you a page where we refer to is on the top of the left page, left side of the page. Let's not, I'll find it. I don't remember now exactly where it is, but I think it was in the beginning when he began to talk about the sweetened waters. So he talked about Ohr Chozer, Ohr Yosher. Okay.
1270.
We don't need to find it right. What?
Bottom of 1270. Toward the bottom of 1270.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, he brings it there. Yeah. And there's more places, but that's a good one because that goes back to what I just read before about the Rishimu. That was that same page I read at the top of the page, where the Kalim are rooted higher than the Ohr. So good, that's the mile of Ohr Chozer. Okay, that's one place, yeah, good. Okay, so that's the mile of Ohr Chozer al Yosher, the Ohr Chozer, Chozer lekadmusei. What does Ohr Chozer do that Ohr Yosher doesn't? It goes back all the way to the primordial original source, b'chinas atzmus ein sof. So let's just use the example of a teacher and a student. So the Gemara says in Tainus, it says, one of the scholars is explaining where he learned what he knows. The students ask him, where did you learn what you know? So he says, I learned much from my teachers. I learned even more from my colleagues, mechaverai. Umetalmidai, from my students, yeser mekulam. I learned more than all of them. So the obvious question, what does that mean? You learn more from your students than from your teachers and your colleagues? Your teachers and colleagues are definitely superior to your students. They're on a higher level of knowledge and scholarship. So that's a perfect example of Ohr Chozer, because the students, the fact that the teacher had to bring it down to the student level, the fact that the students ask questions, even simple questions, but they reach deeper and cause the teacher to understand the topic more than when he learned from his teachers. Because his teachers and even his colleagues was more Ohr Yosher. But there's something about the refractive light that comes from within, from the bottom up, that has immense power that reaches all the way into the deepest parts. It's like when you have to communicate an idea in a talk, in a lecture, or in writing. You have to express it, you have to dig deeper than when you just think about it. That's why it's so difficult to write and to speak. So it seems like counterintuitive. The lower you go, the deeper it gets. Yes, exactly right. Because there's something about bringing it down and that then returns something to you that's stronger than you gave it in the original place. Like you found the expression by tzedakah, the yesim masha balabayis, esim ani esim balabayis. The more than the balabayis, the giver, the one who's giving charity, gives to the pauper is doing more for him than he's doing for the mashpia than the mashpia is doing for the makabel, for the recipient. So there's many expressions that capture this idea. I mean, of course, it relates to the concept of Nods tchilosan b'seifim, b'seifim b'tchilosan, that the beginning is wedged in the end, and the end in the beginning, or what we say every Friday night, seif ma'aseh b'machshava tchila, that the end product is what you originally wanted. So you can create all kinds of things, but if it's not finished, the product, you don't get the pleasure that comes only at the end of the process. So there's something about the end, or the bottom, if you wish, or the return, that's greater than the original investment, in putting it in other terms. So he says, that's the quality of Ohr Chozer and Ohr Yosher. The Ohr Chozer, Chozer lekadmusei. It returns, it brings it back to the original place, all the way in Atzmus Ein Sof, higher than where the Giluyim of the Hashpah, of the transmission came. Okay, so that's one point. Now he's going to go back. As I said, he's going to tie together many things. So everything is very brief. As I said, I'll do my best to elaborate, but just keep that in mind. It's not elaboration. There's only very few lines for each piece. Ukamoy kain hu b'tshuva. And so too it is with tshuva. What is tshuva? I remember tshuva was a key element in the discussion earlier when he talked about the tshuva that comes from the bottom up. Shemin hameitza dafke. And this is too true with the tshuva that comes specifically from distress. Because the tshuva of Avir Rabbah, the tshuva the tshuva that comes from great love of tzaddikim, hui kamoy Ohr Chozer. That's like Ohr Chozer. That's from the intensity and the power of their divine soul emanates so much energy that it can transform the animal soul. So it's also a tshuva, but it's a tshuva like we learned. This was specifically discussed on top of page 1339. So if you look there, he speaks about tshuva ma'ava, and he said that's the cheshech, the oir replaces the darkness. He said, tshuva ma'ava shezdenim nasim kezochias, which can also be by tzaddikim who don't have actual sin. And that's the tshuva generally of the divine soul. But the Hamshach of Tzur, he said, which is deeper, is the tshuva that comes from distress. Remember the cry from distress, the cry from a deathly cry that he called before, the cry of death, is only when you're desperate, the darkest of the dark. He says this tshuva min hameitzer, which is not like tshuva ma'avir rabbah, is also like the Ohr Chozer. Min hameitzer the chatoyim ba'avenas, from the distress and from the dire straits of sins and transgressions. And this tshuva is what? V'hi shanefesh habamis mis'eir b'tshuva, that the animal soul, who has been trapped now in this place of distress, in this place of darkness, of sins and transgressions, you can call it a spiritual dissonance. So when this animal soul, not the divine soul affecting the animal soul from the bottom up, gets stimulated and awakened, b'tshuva, shezeh magia b'bchinas atzmus ein sof shalamayla miyud gimel midas harachim. That reaches atzmus ein sof, higher than the 13 attributes, like we learned earlier. The 13 attributes that tzaddik also has access to. But when it comes from a distress call, from this deeper darkness, that reaches the Tzur, like he said before, the nikras Tzur, that is even higher than the Yud Gimel Midas Harachim. Now you'll say, 1 second, didn't we say before the Yud Gimel Midas Harachim is also on this essential level? So clearly you see from here that there's levels. There's the Rachamim of Seder Shtalshlus. I explained that's not even Yud Gimel Midas Harachim. There's Yud Gimel Midas Harachim in Keser that originates from Gvuras the Atik in Malchus, but it's now a state of Gili. It's Yud Gimel Midas Harachim. And that not necessarily means you reached all the way to the deepest core. It means you reached a higher level of Reimamus. So the king is bestowing and transmitting compassion because that's the nature of Marum, but there's still some relationship. And it's only when it comes from distress, from the darkest place, that reaches into the Etzem, that's the root of the Yud Gimel Midas Harachim. That's even higher than the Yud Gimel Midas Harachim that are level 2, which is level 3, from Rachamim Rabim, that's dafke through Bitla Yesh, which is compared to Ohr Chozer, and now to Teshuva of the Nefesh Habamis, that's crying out from distress. And now he goes back to the pasuk. But I'll stop here for a moment if anybody wants to ask anything, because he's now going to go back to the pasuk that he began discussing on page 1338. What was V'hoye ba'avir Kvodi, when my Kvodi will pass by. So he's going to now sum up what that means, that when my Kvodi will pass by, or as we're going to learn, it's when the Kvodi gets elevated all the way to the highest level, because the Kvodi has been defiled, has been dishonored through sins. We said it affects. He said the Kvodi of the Melech has been hurt to the point that it causes anger, even though it's not. It's not a Geroyin Amiti, a true diminishment, but there is a diminishment. But that diminishment of Chatoim is going to lead us back to the Nikras Tzur that comes by Avir Kvodi, that is coming through the Kvodi elevating. We're going to learn this now inside. But let me stop here if anybody wants to ask anything, and then I'll read on.
I don't understand how the Teshuva for Mina Meitzar reaches above the Butzina de Kardanisa, the Gvurus of Atik, because we said that was the source.
It reaches Butzina de Kardanisa. That's what it
says.
reaches.
Bechinas
That's
Atzmus Ein Sof. It says
reaches.
Shalamayla.
That is the same level of Butzina de Kardanisa, the Helama Atzmi. It says it reaches higher than Yud Gimel Bid Sarachim. You didn't see anywhere that it reaches higher than Butzina de Kardanisa. He never says that. It reaches that level, Butzina de Kardanisa, which is the level of the Reshimu, of the Avir, which is higher than the Yud Gimel Mid Sarachim, which is already a manifestation of Gilui, the Cyrus that come through the hairs, that come from the Gvuras the Atik, manifesting in Moichis Tema into the Yud Gimel Mid Sarachim. So it's higher than the Yud Gimel Mid Sarachim.
Okay.
But it's reaching, but Nikras Tzur and Atzmus Ein Sof is the same level.
Okay, I accept that. That's the
dark matter.
He said that clearly. He said it explicitly earlier. If you go back on page 1338, he said it very clearly that that's the level.
But I thought that's the level of Gvurus of Atik, and that's obviously lower than Atzmus Ein Sof.
Gvurus of Atik is rooted in Atzmus Ein Sof, which means like the Helama Atzmi.
Okay, I'll think about it some more.
And he's going to say it actually more specifically here as well. Any other questions? The key thing to remember, it's higher than Yud Gimel Midas HaRachmim, as he explained on page 1339. Okay. The Zehu, what we said before on page 1338, V'hoya ba'aver kfedi. Remember the verse that he was explaining, that God said, Hine mokim iti, places with me, was within me. And then he says to Moshe, standing on that space and that on the rock. The rock is the source of all of existence. And then he says that V'hoya ba'aver kfedi, when my covet will pass, I will place you, v'samticha b'niklas Tzur, I will place you in the crevice within the rock. So what is the meaning ba'aver kvedi now? He's going back to that verse. So he says, and that's the meaning v'ya ba'aver kvedi. Kvedi yu b'chinas Malchus, canal. Kvedi, like we learned on page 1338, is the level of Malchus. Kavod and Malchus are synonymous. Ein melech shemachal kvedi, ein kvedi machal, because the honor of the king is an essential component of Malchus. So Kavod Kvedi means my Malchus. The Sham HaPagam Tefes Mokim. And there, a Pagam, when someone dishonors the king, when the servant, like you said, does not honor the king, Heipa Heder HaKavod, the Heipa Charotzim, and doesn't listen to his will, what does that mean, Lamaila? That when we don't listen to God, so on the level of Malchus, there's a Pagam. There's a certain wound has been created. You have wounded the king in a certain way. You've diminished him. Not, God forbid, the source, but the way godliness relates to us, because God said, I have a relationship with you. When the Jews built a golden calf, they hurt God. Kavyochel. It's a kavyochel because ultimately it's not really hurting in the source. And even that hurt, we said, also is not a geroyin amiti, because it's coming because of the relationship. Why does God get angry? Why does the king get angry? Because we said because of his intensity, because of his powerful connection. If he wasn't connected with us, he wouldn't be upset. When there's, God forbid, an infidelity, why is the spouse upset? Because they're connected with you. Someone that's not connected doesn't care one way or the other. They're indifferent. But here is because of the deep connection. That's why there's a pagam. But it's not a geroyin amiti because it's coming from the deep passion that the king has, like we learned on page 1338. And when you transform it, you actually reach deeper into the king and go even higher, which is Oyer Ba'aver Kved. So he says, so there's a pagam through sins. But now comes the second next step. So that causes Sham Pagam Tefes Mokim. The Zel Ba'aver Kvedi. And that's the meaning, Ba'aver Kvedi, not just when my covet will pass, when my covet will be defiled, when you'll be over, like we spoke, over ala Torah, which means that you are transgressing against my covet. So it's V'zel Ba'aver Kvedi Shenas Silika Er B'Pchinas Kas. What does that cause? Like we learned, the second level of the Gvura, what does it happens? That the Gvura causes a tzimtzum, the Siluk HaShchina. If you go back to the bottom of page 1339, he said there's two ways that there can be a punishment. One is an abundance of Gili Alakus, which burns everything up that comes close to it. But the second way is like Sa'ir, which is the sour dough, the sour dough, that the yeast, that's din the katnus. So he said that causes a siluk. When God removes himself, the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. We're now in the 3 weeks. What happens is the siluk hashchina. Why? Because of the sins of human beings. And God said, how can I rest among you when you have pushed me out of your life? The whole purpose of the Mishkan, V'shechanti b'seichem, I shall reside among you, within you. And instead, what happened is through your sins, you've pushed me aside. So it causes a siluk. That's the level of Malchus. So Avir Kvodi means that when my Kvod will be affected in a negative way, will be dishonored. And that will cause a siluk, a concealment. So that's b'bchinas kas, in the level of anger. Now comes the next half. So now when the animal soul senses its distress because of its distance and feels desperate, so the tshuva comes from the deliba, the depths of the heart, not coming from revelation. By the tzaddik, it's coming from the divine soul. It's coming from revelation, from Gili, from Ohr. Here it's coming from Helam. So he says, you can say, so Avir Kvodi is number one, is the transgression. And now he's saying, you could also say that Avir Kvodi is referring to Avir Kvodi, the aliyah that comes after the transgression, which is the aliyah b'chinas ha-malchus. Avir Kvodi could also interpret as being like the Kvod is elevating. It elevates to the root and the source. So it goes all the way to the Remes Ha'atzmi, which was higher than any form of Gilui. This level of tshuva that comes from Min HaMesa, from distress, HaMelech HaMerum, like he said earlier, where the king has no relationship at all with anything. That's the power that comes from the Ohr Chozer, from the tshuva, from the depths of the heart of distress of the animal soul, specifically after transgression. And now he's going to say this is the level of the Rishimu. V'zeu gamken inyan b'chinas Avir. This is the Avir that we learned earlier is higher than Ohr. Ohr is the source of Gilui. I'm going now back all the way to page 1329. Avir, he said, is the level of Helam, and Ohr is the level of Gilui. So he says this is the level of Avir that the tshuva reaches. This is the concealment, the Tzur, the concealment of the Ohr that is higher than the revelation, even the way it's in the Etzem, even the way it's in the Etzem, the revelation. This is even higher than that because it's coming from a state of utter fundamental concealment, core concealment. Umuzehu sheirish ha'oir hamachla es ha'cheshech. And this is the root of Ohr that has the power to machla, to extinguish or transform machla, to extinguish the darkness. This is the bitter of Shem Ban. Also references to which he made earlier, not Shem Ma, but Shem Ban that comes from the bottom, the bitter of Shem Ban, which is refining the darkness from the bottom up. That the darkness on its own, because it's coming from within the darkness. Because remember, the root is a koyach nelam, it's concealed. We don't feel it, even though it's the power that is embedded in this powerful tshuva. So the cheshbon is bar acha cheshach nasa er, to the point that the darkness itself has now led and become transformed to Ohr. Va'eru b'chinas helam ha'atzmi de ein sof shenasa b'chinas gili. So the Ohr now is not the etzem Ohr, it's not gili Ohr, is the helam ha'atzmi which has become a gili. What means gili? Is become manifest. Now you see it. Only tshuva reveals it. Without tshuva, it remains completely concealed. That's the level of Avir and the level of the crevice in the rock. Hanal. That has now turned into Hamshacha V'Gili, because remember, Moshe is standing in this crevice, in the womb, in the cavity within the rock, in this level of Avir or Shimu. And from there now is coming Hamshacha V'Gili of what? That the way it is Batzmuse is coming revealed through these Yud Gimel Midas HaRachmim, which is rooted even higher than the regular level of Yud Gimel Midas HaRachmim. V'ze'in Hamtaka Gimel. And this is the third level of sweetening. Shagam came b'kayach elyon, that also comes from a higher power, like we learned before. Avalu b'chinas kayach nelam. But that higher power fundamentally is a concealed state. It's not felt. B'chinas helam atzmi. It's coming from a core concealed place that has no revelation, not like the Gili of the Nefesh Alikis, which is coming from a place of revelation. V'hamtokehi shamar v'acheshach. And the form of sweetening is that the bitterness and the darkness, nepach mitzad atzmam lemasik. They themselves have been transformed into the sweetness. It's from within themselves, lemasik v'oir, to sweetness and light. Shezeu gilib b'chinas helama atzmi. That's the revelation of this core state of concealment. And so this concludes as well the piece where he spoke about, when he spoke about on the bottom of page 1328, and 1329, where he said that doesn't this also come from a higher level? But he explained clearly that it's coming in a concealed way. So it's truly coming from our effort from below, with the godly power that's invested in there, but the godly power is not felt by us. What we feel is the distress when we come out of this dark place of sin and concealment and siluk and the concealment. And that's the transformation from within the third level of the sweetening of the Gvuras. Okay, so you see here how he brought together literally the last 30, 40 pages, just all summed up in very concentrated form and connecting it all. So bottom line is that there are three levels of sweetening the Gvura, but the last two is the key thing that he's addressing. The second level that is coming from Ohr and Gili. The third level is coming from darkness and distress. And the levels are that are alluded to in the verse when God says, "Ba'ver Kvodi," when my Kvod will be dishonored. That and your Teshuva will then be such that will elevate the Kvod, the Malchus, all the way to its root, where everything is forgiven and even transformed. The darkness itself is transformed, not just the Yud Gimel Midas HaRachmim that shines into a tzaddik through his Teshuva of Ava. That's coming from revelation. We're talking now one that's coming from the darkest of the dark, the desperate, what we call hitting rock bottom, or the desperation. And that is that level of Avir, which is the level of Rishimu. Okay, good. Any questions?
Absolutely magnificent. Absolutely a magnificent job he did. Wow, I can't get over it. Thank you.
This third level, where person's hit rock bottom, total concealment of godliness, and then he does Teshuva from there, and that reveals the Helam Ha'atzmi, reaches the highest level possible, with transforming Hayesh La'ayin. My question to you is, ultimately, he's still doing it with the knowledge that Teshuva is still doing it with the knowledge of the Giloy of Hashem, a Giloy of, person's hit rock bottom. I need help, God. It's total concealment.
Hold on. Where does it say that he needs help, God? It's coming from hitting rock bottom means actually desperation.
That's what I mean.
It doesn't say any help, God, at all. As a person is completely lost in the darkest thing. And there's something there. We spoke about this at length. You remember the conversation about spiritual hypothermia, where a person is completely, no, we're not talking about it, that he's recognizing the need of God. He just recognizes how dark it is, and that creates a tremendous distress within him. That's what we're discussing here.
So who's he crying out to? What is he invoking? He's crying out from the bottom, from rock bottom. He cries out.
Well, ask anybody that's a recovering alcoholic or addict. They'll tell you, I just hit a place that my life was completely lost and I just was desperate. Sometimes it's not even a cry for help. Sometimes it's a cry for help, but it's definitely not coming from any gilui. If you go back to the bottom of page 1328, he speaks about this explicitly. He asked the question, but isn't this itself coming from a gilui? This very call, this cry. Like you say, the Shefer Gadol cries out, and that wakes up the lost souls. Or Yom Kippur, he said, is causing even the Kal Shabakalim to be awakened. So he said, isn't that a gilui? He asked that question explicitly. And that's why he elaborated, and I explained it at length there. There's also a letter from the Rebbe that the Rebbe also cites it, and I use that as well, to explain that it's a koyach nelam. The person does not feel any gilui. It's not like they feel, oh, today's Yom Kippur, hey, let me go to shul. That's already a gilui. They're feeling none of that. A person is a lost soul. He uses the words, I'm actually quoting straight from that page. He said there that, where's the exact expression here? It says clearly, 1 second. Yeah, well, we'll read there, you'll see exactly the language. So it's like when a person, I gave the example hypothermia, where does a child have the wisdom to know that you have to disconnect from terrible abuse, have an out-of-body experience? Where does the child have the knowledge to save their vital organs and go into a state of complete, almost death state? This is a power that we don't access. It's embedded within us, that God is saying that even in the darkest moments, there's a power of me there, but you're not going to feel it. You're only going to feel distance. The people that came out of the Holocaust will tell you that why they continue to maintain strength, they have no idea where it came from. It came from something that they just had this inner strength. It wasn't through a revelation. It was actually through the darkest of the dark. So that's a state where of cold that can only become from a place of helama atzmi, because it's so concealed. It's not like somebody suddenly comes and says to you, hey, wake up, I have something to tell you. Someone's starting to learn Tanya, and they say, oh, wow, that's powerful. Some people have it that way. That's through a certain gilui. But then there's an experience that comes completely from distress, like he called either from even feeling death, literally, like a deathly cry. On page 1327. I would suggest going back there. That's where you discussed at length where how it manifests, this cry, the darkness that it brings, that it comes from.
I understand that when he's in this distress and this complete concealment of godliness, and he's hit rock bottom, that there's no gilui of God. Okay, I can understand that. But aren't we talking about doing tshuva, which is returning to God, meaning that the person, the alcoholic, you brought up an alcoholic, the 12 steps invokes, you want to get out of your total concealment, believe in God. You have to believe in Creator. That's the first step.
But you know how many, but people don't go to 12 steps immediately. First, they have to hit rock bottom to want to go. You're talking about they're already in the process of healing.
Yes.
We're talking about, but nobody begins the process of healing automatically. It comes from a distress that forces them to go. That's the point. You're talking they're already healing and growing. We're talking about what causes the person is not a gilui. It's coming from a completely concealed place. It's coming from within a distress call. And that's all that's coming from, feeling desperation. Anyway, I'm not sure what else I can say. Why don't you go back? He literally asked the question and answers it. Why not just read there? I'm telling you what page it is. Go back to page, what did I say? Bottom of page, where he asked this question explicitly.
1328, wasn't it?
Was it 1328? Yeah. He asks it explicitly. Just read it. He says, doesn't it come from a gili ohr? And he says, no, it doesn't. It comes from something there's no revelation. I've talked to hundreds, if not thousands of people who've been in this state, not people who came to a speech or read something or were walking the street and suddenly had an epiphany. People who are really desperate, and they'll say, I can't tell you, I was at a point where everything was lost. So I said, so what happened? And I resisted and avoided going to 12 steps. I resisted and avoiding help. I wasn't interested. It was just complete desperation. I had no choice. So what pushed over the person from completely no choice? Why can't they just live in a life of no choice, of desperation? We know there are people that are homeless people. There are people living right now in desperate states, and they don't do anything about it. So it's not like desperation automatically causes you to do tshuva. But when it does, it's coming from a place, something is there. And you would wonder, some people would say, no, maybe this is a lost case. This person is never going to return. But since there's a hela ma'atzmi embedded in there, that's why we believe that even the person who's a lost soul, I mean, you know, kind of language the Rebbe Rashab used earlier when he said oivdim. You just read on top of page 1327. It's shocking words that he says there. He says these words. He says it's talking about a sheep that has gotten completely lost in a strange place, and no way to find it, even with great search. A neshama that's completely lost. And ended up in places that there's no way they cannot return to their Father in heaven. That's the expression he used. That's how lost they are. Completely assimilated. He uses that expression too. So you have to read those pages. I would go to 1327, bottom of 1328. That's what I would suggest. I can go over it again, but right now, I want to end this class. Maybe I'll discuss it more tomorrow at length. But we reviewed it then quite a few times.
I remember the review, but I'm still having a hard time understanding.
So that's why I suggest to do what I do. Why don't you go back and read it inside, if you need to, 100 times until you get it. What should I tell you? There's certain. I can give you my explanation. I've processed it. I think I understand it to some extent. If you don't, I don't know what else I can say. I would say read it again and again and try to absorb what he's saying. He is saying.
Do you have time? Sorry, go ahead.
If you read it and have a question on a line he says there, I'll be happy to explain it. But right now, you're really asking me pshat in the mimer itself. It's not like, so why don't you read it and see which line you're having a problem with? That's what I would suggest. That's easier for me then to see where your real issue is. Is it with the Melam part? Is it with the lost part? Teshuva doesn't always take on the way you understand Teshuva. Teshuva does not necessarily mean an awakening. Teshuva means sometimes hitting rock bottom and there's nowhere else to go. And that causes tremendous distress. Distress is also a cry. It's true, it is a cry, but it's coming from complete concealment, not from any revelation. So a cry that comes from distress, if you hear someone crying, help, 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 and they're at the bottom of, they're sinking in an ocean, you'd call that a gilui? Where's the gilui there? The gilui is that they're crying, yes, because there is a root in the Helam Asmi, but there's no gilui. It's like they're drowning and they're in danger of dying. So I see that as complete concealment, not revelation.
That I understand. It's the next step that I'm trying to think.
But the next step is not what we're talking about. We're talking about the first step.
Oh, okay. All right. Then I understand my problems. I want to, that person that's drowning, he's definitely in complete concealment. He's a lost soul. There's no help. It's a death cry, as the Rebbe says. That I can understand. That's helamatz.
That's what he's talking about. That's the Ohr Chozer. That's what he's talking about. That step. What happens after Rabbi Eliezer ben Dodaya, I think he's going to mention it at some point, was at that point. When he, after a life of terrible sin, and he just cried out, and with that cry, he earned the entire Kanai Lama B'Shah Achas. So that, okay, we'll talk about it some more. You want to ask a question, Yitzchak?
Yeah, real quick, if you can't. I'm just having a hard time with grammar, use of words, where he says, "Sha'ali dizay some ticha b'nikras Tzur." Just, I know he's referencing that part we learned about where Eibishter put Moshe Rabbeinu in the crevice of the rock to show him this place from which this Gimel Mizrach. Okay, but the question is this just a reference to that discussion, or this is active language? When you do tshuva, I shall place v'samticha b'nikros Tzur. God seems like there's some involvement of God here, unless this is just a reference to that discussion where you reach that dark place, and as a result of that, you find yourself in the place of the Helam Atzmi, where you find the shorish of the Gimel Midas Rachamim. So, in other words, this code language for that whole discussion, or is this mamash v'samticha b'nikros Tzur? Like when you reach that rock bottom, all of a sudden God actively puts
the verse. The verse in Kisisa is referring to how Hashem reveals the 13 attributes of compassion, right?
Correct.
So let's start with that. So you're talking about Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu is beseeching and begging God to forgive the people for their great sin of the golden calf. And he's explaining what God is doing in response to that. As Moshe reaches deeper into God by these requests, God is revealing to him the secret of how you transform darkness. So Moshe self-experienced it. What did he experience? That he was placed by God in the Rishimu, in the Avir, in the Butzina de Kardanissa, the root, the Gvuras of Atik, rooted in the Helam Atzmi, which is the level of Tzur. And there, God says, Ba'ver Kvodi, when my covet will be dishonored, as it was by the Jews when they built the golden calf, then I'm giving you now the power of what you can do to transform it. How Malchus through Teshuva is elevated all the way to that core essence, that when you access it, you'll be able to be forgiven and transformed in the deepest possible way. So the story with Moshe is an actual. He's living it through. It's not metaphor. It's the actual definition of the verses, what they really mean. Why would God put him in a rock? What does the rock represent? What is the crevice in the rock? What does the covet represent?
I get all that, but why?
This is the meaning of the verse. 1 second. This is the meaning of the verse. Now, once we have the Torah telling us what happened then, so now we also have essentially a formula for how we too, when we go through these challenges in life and our darkness, we too can access this level of the rock and the level of Yud-Gimel Mitzarachimim and all the way to the highest levels of transformation. So what's not clear?
What's not clear is that he goes back and references the language as if
he's not referencing the language. He's explaining that verse as he began explaining it. It's not going back. It's the end of a discussion that began on page 1333, where he starts explaining the whole verse. And I gave a whole introduction, if you recall, of why he's doing that. And then specifically, he's explaining now, finishing the subject matter that he began on 1338. He's not referencing it. He's ending the explanation that he began discussing back then, which is all based, of course, on the Maimer of Tovkuf Samach Beis, Ki B'yom Hazeh Yechaber, of the Alter Rebbe. So it's all, this is, so it's not referencing, he's actually concluding what he said there. If you go back to 1338, you'll speak. He spoke about Kvodi and Malchus, the Begam, the Geroyim.
Right. No, I remember all that.
And that all leading now to concluding
what I said by referencing it, I meant he's continuing that discussion rather than making a
obvious.
New point.
I'm not looking to figure out what you said. I'm trying to understand you. Do you have any question on what I just explained?
No, I get all that 100%. Thank you.
Okay, good.
No, it's just that it's so concentrated. I guess I'm asking, when you get to that place, and I don't think this is the case, what I'm going to say now, I don't think it says this, but that when you get to that place, God sort of is actively involved in helping you find that revelation. I don't think it says that.
I wouldn't put it quite that way. I would put it this way, that God embedded in the darkest moments of our lives, the Helam Atzmi is there. However, it's completely concealed. And when a person reaches that place and they have a cry of distress, they are able to access. That's what it's originating from there, and they're able to access. And then when they do that, then they're transforming the darkness itself into light, and the bitterness.
I get that.
That's the way
but
I
the
would put it.
Samticha is referring to Moshe Rabbeinu, not each of us when we hit that dark place, because the Samticha is transitive.
For Samticha simply means that when you're in a place of distress, I place you in the Nikras Tzur. You are connected to the Gvuras of Atik or Butzina de Kardenis and the Helam Atzmi. So it's referring to all of us.
Mm-hmm. When that happens, then you're in this place where you can find your Gimel Midas Arachamim. Got it.
That's the solution. But now we're talking about that the darkness part. It's the Tzur part.
Yes, I got it. It's just an interesting use of language that there's active, it's transitive. God is placing us in
the whole
this place.
Torah is that way. When it says in the Torah, everything that says in the Torah is a lesson in our lives. So it says that Hashem, Noach went into the ark. We learn from that we also go into our spiritual arcs. Whatever you're saying applies to every story in the Torah. Every individual story is also a collective story of our own lives. That's called Hayra. When Lech Lecha, Hashem says to Avram, Lech Lecha ma'artzecha. So Avram was meant to actually leave his homeland, but we're also told, leave our homeland, our routines and habits and so on. So basically you're talking about learning Torah means you're learning Torah of their events that we learned. People went out of Mitzrayim, but we also go out of Mitzrayim. So everything that's in the Torah has application to our lives in a spiritual sense.
Yeah.
So
even when Yehuda went up to Yosef and embraced him, actually became higher eventually. That was also that. It's a matzah thing that could be spread out to almost everything we do.
Yeah, no, you answered my question. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll stop here at the end